Noises in the attic. I know that typically people share personal encounters here, but I knew after finding the subreddit that I needed to share this. This happened to my wife's aunt, Sarah. I apologize that I cannot relay some of her emotions and at times have to skimp on a few details, as it is a second-hand account as told by my wife. This was 10 or 15 years ago, and Sarah had recently been divorced. Her husband moved out, and Sarah continued living in the house by herself for some time after that. The house was in a typical neighborhood and wasn't secluded or off by itself or anything like that. As Sarah became used to living alone again, she felt like she kept hearing things in her attic and began to wonder what was making the noises she heard. She called the police and had them come sweep her attic looking for traces of anyone living up there, but they found nothing and told her she had probably just heard a raccoon or squirrel. In the days after, she felt like the noises were getting louder and that there was no way it was a small animal. She called the police again a week later, and the same thing happened. They didn't find anything yet again. A few days after the second call to the police, Sarah came home from work earlier than usual. Fortunately for her, she had started dating during that time, and her boyfriend was with her when she came home that day. As she got out of the car, in her garage, she noticed something out of place and scary as hell at the door. A pair of muddy men's boots. I like to think that if she'd been alone, she'd had enough sense to not enter her house at that point. But luckily, her boyfriend was with her. They cautiously entered the house and discovered upon opening the door a man standing naked in the laundry room doing his laundry. Sarah went to call the police, but the phone wasn't working, and she ended up going next door to use the phone. I'm fuzzy on the details here, but they managed to keep him in place in time for the police to arrive, and they took him away. Turns out that this guy had access to her house somehow, and he had indeed been spending time in the attic. The police found a small hole in the attic above her bedroom where he had been watching her, and on that day, he cut the phone line and had put a knife under her pillow. God only knows what would have happened had she come home by herself. But thankfully, that didn't happen. I don't know any more details about the guy other than the fact that the cops took him away and he presumably spent time in jail. My neighbor was in my attic. So around 10 to 12 years ago, in England, I lived in a little 2-bedroom house on a long road. It is a terraced house on a long strip of other terraced houses. Back in the day, all the attics were joined and you could literally travel through them. Years later, they realized it was a bad idea. Fire spreading, burglars, etc. And so all the attics were bricked up so each house was secure. One night, I was soaking in the bath when I heard a noise above me. Thinking it may be an animal or something, I just ignored it. This went on for a few weeks, only it was getting to the point I would only hear the noises when I was in the bath or shower or getting changed. I got a friend to check the attic, and he told me he didn't see anything. He just stuck his head inside, which just confirmed my animal story. Not much happened after that for about a month or two, when one night I was alone. I was getting ready to take a shower as I was heading out with friends. I heard the same noises above when all of a sudden, the dog started going crazy, barking and looking directly above me. Clearly, I was freaked out and decided to get ready at a friend's house. The next day, I was outside my house. My neighbor shouted at me. Now, my neighbor is creepy as hell. Small, stinky, strange looking with a hint of crazy in his eyes. He asked if I was okay. Being polite and trying to show him he doesn't really bother me, I said yes and went about my business. Just as I got to my door, he asked if I got to my friends okay. At first, without thinking, I said yes and thank you, smiled and waved goodbye. But when I got inside my house, I realized that he would not know I was at my friend's house unless he heard me on the phone. And as I was so creeped out the night previously, I was practically whispering to my friend. Anyway, I rang family members, told my dad that they all came round. They turned the lights on in the bathroom, but kept all the other lights off, opened the attic door, and you could see two lights shining right through the top of the attic, two tiny little holes. My bathroom ceiling was quite dark, so I never noticed them. My dad went in. He was gone a while, but when he returned, he was blazing angry. He ignored everyone and walked straight outside to the neighbor's house. We heard him shouting for the neighbor to open the door, but he was not home. I asked my cousin to go up to check it out. When he came back down, he told me that the wall separating the attics had been knocked through. Most of the brickwork was on my side, so it was knocked through from the other side. We called the police, but they told us there was no proof he had done anything. The neighbor told the police he never used the attic, and the previous tenants were to blame. Clearly, he was to blame, the creepy old pervert. I don't think I have ever been so disturbed, knowing that the dirty pervert had been watching me for all that time. I never stayed in that house again. Trapped in the attic. This is my sister's story, which she is happy for me to share, and took place 3 years ago on New Year's Eve. My sister is a student in South London and has lived in some pretty awful student accommodation during her time studying. This particular house she lived in had trouble with the front door lock and was just off a very busy main road. She had 4 other housemates, and her room was in the attic, which obviously is the setup for all creepy happenings, but in reality was a very nice conversion. On this particular evening, she was planning on heading out later on to celebrate New Year's Eve, locally with her friends. She was in the house alone while she got ready, and had left her room to put her makeup on in the bathroom. While she was doing this, she heard a really loud knock on the front door and some scuffling outside. Assuming it was one of her housemates coming back to grab something, she headed downstairs to let them in. As she got closer to the door, she heard voices she didn't recognize and could see the shapes of 2 people through the frosted glass. We've lived in London for all our lives and are both probably quick to not trust the situation, so she kept quiet and slowly made her way back upstairs when the door literally flies open with a huge bang, and a man and a woman come flying in. She could smell the alcohol on these 2 from the floor up, and from the way they were talking, she could tell they were totally off their faces on a shit ton of drugs too. As they immediately start up to force entry into the first bedroom on the ground floor and grab anything they can find. My sister is in a panic. She makes a dash up the staircase to her attic room to stay out of their way and out of sight until she can figure out what to do next. In her room, she finds her phone and immediately calls the police. She has to tell the operator what's going on as quietly as possible and is told that the police will be there in 12 minutes. She told that this 12 minutes was the longest and most terrifying 12 minutes of her life, as she hears the banging and smashing noises from downstairs starting to move up the house. It is, of course, at this moment that she remembers the staircase which leads up to the attic is still down, as she didn't have time to pull it up behind her in her frenzied dash to her room. To counter this frankly appalling realization, she moves every item of furniture over the trapdoor and then sits on top of it to stop them gaining entry if they tried. As she sits there, too terrified to even breathe and her heartbeat racing in her ears, she hears them kick down the very last door in the house, right next to her staircase. The woman is screaming and smashing things up, and the man is shouting instructions about what items to steal. These total dickheads are so confident and off their faces they didn't even bother to keep quiet, which makes them so much scarier. She hasn't got a doubt that if a person confronted them or they found someone in the house, they would become very violent. As it became obvious to both of them and her that the last place to try is her room, she hears the most beautiful sound anyone can ever hear. As the yell of police echoes up the stairs. These two fuckers might be out of it, but they know what this means. The guy just jumps out the second floor window, lands on the shed, and escapes over the garden fence. But the woman can't figure out which way to run and is caught by the police, screaming, biting, scratching, and swearing. My sister, sitting on top of a chest of drawers over her trapdoor, in exactly the same position she has been for those seemingly never-ending 12 minutes, can only bring herself to open the trapdoor once the police tell her over and over again that it is safe to do so. The devastation of the house is shocking and makes her so grateful that she had a place to hide, but also compounds how terrifying it was to have to sit helpless and trapped in the attic as these people violently tore apart every room in the house, systematically making their way closer and closer to her hiding place. She speaks to the police, gives her statement, and then calls my mom in a total wreck. She goes to stay with my mom and little sister for a few days while it's being sorted out, then moves in with her boyfriend, who is also a student at the same university. She only returns to collect her stuff, which at least is still around. Everyone else, door locked or unlocked, had their valuables stolen. This story strikes me with total dread, and is probably one of the scariest things I've heard. Imagine what it must be like for her makes me feel sick. The man never got caught, and the landlord, who never fixed their front door lock before the break-in, after being repeatedly asked, tried to make my sister keep paying her rent after she moved out as per the contract agreement. Well, fuck that. She gave him an elaborate array of places he could shove his contract, and I'm pleased to report he must have chosen one of them, because that was the end of it.